The cold was not merely a condition of the air. It was a physical presence, an architect of misery that had reshaped the small, wind-scoured town into a monument of gray ice and frozen mud. It seeped through the clapboard walls of the mercantile, sank its teeth into the timbers of the church, and laid a brittle, crystalline skin over every puddle and trough. For the woman who stood with her small son near the closed-off entrance to the livery, the cold was a predator. It stalked the hollows of her worn coat, hunted the thin fabric of her son's trousers, and gnawed at the last vestiges of warmth that clung to their bones. She had a name, but it felt like a relic from another life, a word that belonged to a person who had known soft beds and full plates. Here, she was only a shape, an inconvenience huddled against the wind, her face turned away from the hard, incurious stares of the townsfolk who bustled past. They saw her, of course. It was impossible not to see the stark poverty of her, the foreign cut of her features that spoke of a different land and a different sun, the desperation that clung to her like a shroud. But they looked through her, their gazes sliding past, as if she were a ghost already. Her son, a boy of 6 with eyes too old for his face, pressed against her leg, his small hand tucked into hers, a fragile anchor in a sea of indifference. He did not cry or complain. He had learned the futility of it weeks ago. A wagon rumbled down the rutted street, its wheels cracking the ice with a sound like breaking bones. It was a solid, utilitarian thing, built for work, not for show, and the man who drove it matched it perfectly. He was a block of a man, wide in the shoulder and weathered by a life lived under an open and often unforgiving sky. He pulled the team to a halt in front of the mercantile, his movements deliberate, economical. He did not seem to feel the cold, or if he did, he gave it no satisfaction. He swung down from the wagon seat, his boots landing with a solid thud on the frozen earth. He saw them immediately. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, passed over them, and for a moment, the woman expected the same dismissive slide she had received from everyone else. But his gaze did not slide away. It lingered. It was not a look of pity, which would have been its own kind of insult. It was a look of assessment, of quiet, searching attention, as if he were judging the soundness of a fence post or the health of a calf. He took in the threadbare coat, the boy's shivering, the exhausted slump of the woman's shoulders, and the defiant tilt of her chin. He went into the mercantile. The bell over the door jangled a cheerful, false welcome. The woman watched him go, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. He was just another closed door. She pulled her son closer, trying to shield him with her own body, a futile gesture against a cold that came from within as much as without. She closed her eyes and thought of nothing. It was the only way to endure. The bell jangled again. The man emerged, carrying a heavy burlap sack over one shoulder and a smaller paper-wrapped parcel in his hand. He loaded the sack into the back of his wagon and then turned, his gaze finding them again across the bleak expanse of the street. He hesitated for a beat, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression, then he walked toward them. He stopped a few feet away, his presence a solid break in the relentless wind. He did not offer pleasantries. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You're not from around here." It was not a question. The woman shook her head, her throat too tight for words. "The stage doesn't run again till the thaw," he stated, his eyes on the darkening clouds that were gathering in the west. "That's weeks away. Another storm is coming. A bad one, Inch." She knew. She could feel it in the air, a drop in pressure that her body registered as a primal threat. He looked from her to the boy, whose small face was pale with cold. A woman and a child have no business standing on a street corner waiting for a blizzard. "We have no other place to be," she finally managed to say, her voice a thin, reedy thing. The man considered this, his expression unchanging. He seemed to be weighing a set of facts, performing a cold, internal arithmetic. "I have a ranch. North of here. It's isolated. I lost my hand last month. Broke his leg. There's work. Mucking stalls, tending the stock, splitting wood, cooking, mending. It's hard work, but it's a roof and a fire. I need the help. You need the shelter." The offer hung in the air between them, as stark and unadorned as the man himself. It was not charity. It was a transaction, a brutally practical solution to two separate problems. There was no kindness in it, and for that, she was strangely grateful. Kindness was a currency she could not repay. Work, she understood. We would not be a burden, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. I don't abide burdens, he said simply. He looked at the sky again. The storm won't wait. My wagon's there. The choice is yours. He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked back to his wagon, leaving the decision to her, to the wind, to the sheer absence of any other option. He climbed onto the seat and took up the reins, his posture suggesting he would be equally untroubled whether they followed or not. The woman looked at her son. His teeth were chattering now, a faint, desperate clicking. His eyes pleaded with her. The choice had never been a choice at all. Taking her son's hand, she walked across the street and stood by the wagon. The man looked down at them, gave a single, curt nod, and reached down a hand to help her up. His grip was firm, calloused, and blessedly warm. The journey to the homestead was a battle waged in silence. The wind rose, a keening thing that clawed at the canvas wagon cover and drove pellets of ice and snow into their faces. The rancher handled the team with an ingrained competence, his attention fixed on the barely visible track ahead. He had not spoken a word since they had left the town behind. After a few minutes, he reached behind him and pulled a thick, greasy-smelling wool blanket from a storage box, handing it back to her without looking. Wrap the boy in that. She did as she was told, cocooning her son in the rough fabric. The blanket smelled of horse and hay and wood smoke, the scent of a life of hard, honest labor. It was the smell of survival. The boy, exhausted and finally feeling a measure of warmth, soon fell asleep, his head resting heavily in her lap. She stared out at the landscape, a rolling, featureless expanse of white under a bruised purple sky. It was a world stripped of all color, all softness. It felt like an extension of the emptiness inside her. It was nearly dark when they arrived. The homestead was nestled in a small valley, partially shielded from the wind by a stand of tall, skeletal pines. A long, low cabin sat at the center, with a solid-looking barn and a few smaller outbuildings huddled nearby. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney of the cabin, a lonely signal of life in the vast wilderness. The place was brutally simple, built for function, not comfort. It was clean, well-maintained, but it radiated a profound and aching emptiness. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. Inside, a fire was already banked in the large stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light over the single large room. The cabin was as Spartan as its owner. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was built into one corner. A set of shelves held a few plates and tins. The floor was swept clean. There was not a single photograph, not a single decorative object, not a single touch that would suggest a life beyond mere existence. The rancher gestured toward the fire. Get warm. He went to the stove, stoking the embers and adding fresh wood. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she had noted earlier, every action with a purpose. He filled a pot with water from a bucket and set it to boil, then began slicing bacon and potatoes. The sounds, the crackle of the fire, the scrape of the knife on the cutting board, were the only interruptions to a silence that felt as deep and as cold as the snow outside. When the food was ready, he served it onto 2 tin plates and set them on the table. He did not join them. He took his own plate and sat on a stool by the fire, his back to them. The woman and her son ate with a ravenous, desperate hunger they had tried to suppress for days. The simple meal of fried bacon and potatoes was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She was aware of the man by the fire, of his stillness, his detached curiosity as he listened to the scrape of their forks against the plates. He was like a naturalist observing a pair of strange creatures he had brought back to his lair. When they were finished, she gathered the plates and washed them in a basin of hot water from the stove. She did not have to be told. She understood the unspoken terms of their arrangement. She was here to work. Her son, now awake and revived by the food and warmth, sat on the floor by the hearth, watching the flames with a kind of mesmerized awe. There's a loft, the man said, still not turning around. He pointed with his chin toward a ladder in the corner. Hay mattresses, extra blankets in that chest. She looked up at the darkened space. It was a clear physical and emotional separation. They were not guests. They were a necessity he had acquired, like a new shovel or a sack of feed. The kindness he had shown, such as it was, felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave a non-committal grunt in reply. She led her son to the ladder. He climbed up eagerly, his weariness forgotten in the novelty of the sleeping arrangement. She followed, pulling herself into the small, hay-scented space. There were, as he had said, 2 mattresses and a chest full of thick wool blankets. She made up their beds, the howl of the wind outside a constant, menacing reminder of what they had escaped. Down below, the man finished his meal, cleaned his plate, and methodically checked the latches on the door and the shutters on the windows. He was a man who left nothing to chance. He banked the fire for the night, and the cabin was plunged into a deep, consuming darkness, broken only by the faint orange glow of the embers. Lying beside her sleeping child, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet, steady breathing of the stranger below, the woman felt a sliver of something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. A fragile, terrifying hope. The storm lasted for 3 days. They were confined to the cabin, the world outside a maelstrom of white. The rancher established a rhythm that was as predictable and relentless as a clock. He rose before dawn, tended the fire, and went out to the barn to care for the livestock, returning encrusted in snow, his face raw from the wind. He would eat, then set about his indoor chores, mending harnesses, sharpening tools, oiling his rifle. He moved in a bubble of self-contained silence, a man so accustomed to his own company that the presence of others was an intrusion he tolerated rather than welcomed. The woman and her son learned his rhythms, moving around him like water flowing around a stone. She cooked and cleaned, her hands quickly rediscovering the familiar domestic tasks. She found a stash of mending in a wooden chest and set to work, her needle flying with a practiced skill. She repaired his worn shirts, patched his canvas trousers, and darned his thick wool socks. It was a way of making herself useful, of earning their keep, of stating without words that they would not be idle. The boy, restless from the confinement, was remarkably well behaved. He sat by the fire, drawing pictures on a slate the rancher had produced from a shelf without comment. He seemed to understand that their sanctuary was conditional, their safety dependent on the goodwill of this quiet, somber man. On the 4th morning, the wind died. The silence that followed was startling, profound. The rancher opened the cabin door to a world transformed. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sculpting the landscape into soft, alien shapes. The sun was a pale, watery disk in a sky of washed-out blue. A new set of challenges now presented itself. Paths needed to be shoveled, the roofs of the barn and outbuildings cleared of their heavy burden of snow, and fences checked for damage. The rancher pulled on his heavy coat and gloves. "Stay inside," he said. The boy, it was a command. The woman watched him take a large shovel and begin the back-breaking work of digging a path to the barn. She felt a surge of restless energy. She had not survived this long by being sheltered. She waited until her son was absorbed with his slate. Then she pulled on her own thin coat and went outside. The cold was shocking, a slap in the face, but the air was clean and sharp. She found another, smaller shovel leaning against the cabin wall. She began to work on a path to the woodpile, her movements awkward at first, her muscles protesting. The rancher stopped his own work and watched her for a long moment. His face was unreadable, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun on the snow. "I told you to stay inside," he said, his voice flat. "I will not be a sheltered pet," she replied, not looking at him, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "We will earn our place here. My son and I." It was a statement, not a plea. He did not argue. He watched her for another moment, then turned and resumed his own work, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel the only sound. He did not offer help, but he did not send her back inside either. He seemed to have made a decision, a reluctant acceptance. They worked in silence for hours, 2 solitary figures carving a life out of the frozen wilderness. Her initial awkwardness gave way to a steady rhythm, and though her body ached, a sense of satisfaction grew within her. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. In the days that followed, she proved her worth time and again. She had a surprising strength and an even more surprising resilience. She learned to milk the single dairy cow, her hands gentle and sure. She learned to feed the chickens and gather the precious eggs. The rancher showed her how to do things once, with a minimum of words, and she never had to be shown again. He was a gruff but patient teacher, his respect growing with every task she mastered. One afternoon, while searching for extra rags in a large sea chest in the loft, her hand brushed against something hard and wooden at the bottom. Curious, she pulled it out. It was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its paint worn away by the grip of a small hand. Tucked beside it was a fragile, yellowed piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully. It was a child's drawing, a stick-figure family under a lopsided sun. A tall man, a woman with a triangle dress, and a small girl with wild, spiraling hair. The raw, simple love in the drawing was a punch to the gut. She heard his footsteps on the ladder and quickly tried to hide the objects, but it was too late. He stood on the top rung, his large frame filling the entrance to the loft, his eyes fixed on the drawing in her hand. The silence that descended was absolute, heavy with a grief so old and so deep it felt like a permanent part of the cabin structure. He did not speak. He simply looked at the drawing, and in that look, she saw the ghost of the man he must have been before the silence had taken root. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently taking the paper and the wooden horse from her. He looked at them for a long moment, then carefully placed them back in the bottom of the chest and closed the lid. He turned and descended the ladder without a word, but the shared moment of discovery had changed something between them. He was no longer just her rescuer, and she was no longer just a stray he had taken in. They were two people living in a house full of ghosts. Weeks turned into a month. The harshest bite of winter began to recede, replaced by days of brilliant, cold sunshine that hinted at the coming thaw. The fragile piece of their existence on the ranch had begun to feel almost permanent, a quiet routine built on shared work and unspoken understanding. But the world was larger than the small valley, and eventually, it came calling. They were running low on flour and salt, and the rancher announced one morning that they would have to make the trip into town. The woman felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The town represented everything she had fled: judgment, suspicion, the cold indifference of strangers. Here on the ranch, she had carved out a space where she was defined by her work and her resilience. In town, she was once again the outsider, the strange woman with the foreign face. But the trip was a necessity, so she bundled her son warmly and climbed onto the wagon seat beside the rancher, her back straight, her face a mask of neutrality. The town was waking from its winter hibernation. There were more people on the street, their faces pale but their spirits lifted by the promise of spring. As the rancher guided the wagon toward the mercantile, the woman felt the familiar weight of curious and hostile stares. Whispers followed them like the rustle of dry leaves. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of coffee, leather, and gossip. A group of women stood near the counter, their conversation halting as the rancher and his companions entered. At the center of the group was a woman whose expensive, fur-trimmed coat and perfectly coiffed hair stood in stark contrast to the rough-hewn world around her. She was the wife of the town's most powerful man, a banker who held the mortgages on half the properties in the county. Her smile was as bright and as cold as winter sunlight. "Well, look what the thaw has brought in," she said, her voice carrying across the store. It was a voice accustomed to being heard, a voice that dripped with false pleasantry. She directed her smile at the rancher, though her eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on the woman beside him. "We were all so worried about you, out there all alone this winter. It seems our worries were misplaced." The rancher merely nodded, his face impassive, and handed his list to the shopkeeper. He had no time for social games. The woman was not so easily deterred. She glided closer, her coterie of followers trailing in her wake. She circled the woman and her son as if they were livestock up for auction. "And who is this you've brought us? Some new charity case? I do hope you're being careful. One hears such stories about her kind. Drifters, taking advantage of good, Christian men." The insinuation was as ugly as it was clear. The other women tittered, their eyes darting back and forth, savoring the public shaming. The woman felt her face flush with heat, but she held her ground, her hand resting protectively on her son's shoulder. She would not give this creature the satisfaction of her fear or her anger. The banker's wife leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that was meant to be overheard by everyone. "A man has needs, of course. We all understand that. But to bring this filth into a decent community, it's an affront. That was when the rancher moved. He had been standing by the counter, his back to the scene, but he turned now, his quiet presence suddenly dominating the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He took 2 deliberate steps and stood beside the woman, placing himself physically between her and her accuser. He looked down at the banker's wife, his winter sky eyes flat and hard. "They are with me," he said. The 3 words were simple, declarative, and absolute. They were a shield. They were a claim. He held the banker's wife's gaze until she, for the first time perhaps in her life, was forced to look away, a flicker of fury and humiliation in her eyes. He then took the woman's hand. It was not a gesture of romance, but of solidarity, a public declaration of allegiance. In front of them all, he took her hand, its calluses a testament to the work she had done, and held it firmly in his own. "Our business is done here," he said to the stunned shopkeeper, who quickly finished packing their supplies. The rancher paid, and still holding her hand, led her and her son out of the store, leaving a wake of shocked silence behind them. The banker's wife stood frozen, her face a mask of fury. She had fired a warning shot, intending to assert her social dominance, but it had been deflected, turned back on her with a quiet authority she could not challenge. The fragile peace of the ranch had been shattered, their private arrangement now a matter of public concern. The ride home was conducted in a silence that was heavier and more fraught with unspoken things than any that had come before. Back in the cabin, the tension from town followed them, settling into the corners of the room like dust. The rancher unhitched the team and tended to the horses with his usual methodical calm, but the woman could see a new tightness in his shoulders, a grim set to his jaw. She put away the supplies, her movements quick and jerky. Her son, sensing the strained atmosphere, sat quietly by the fire, his small face troubled. The confrontation had frightened him. Night fell. They ate their dinner in a silence that was no longer comfortable or companionable, but thick with the day's ugly events. The questions that had been circling in the woman's mind finally broke free. She had to understand. After she had tucked her son into his bed in the loft, she came back down the ladder. The rancher was sitting at the table, staring into the flames of the fire, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. She stood across the table from him, her hands clasped together to stop their trembling. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that? In the store? Why did you help us that first day?" He did not look at her. He continued to stare into the fire as if the answers were written in the dancing flames. A long time passed. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the distant sigh of the wind in the pines. She thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with disuse, the sound of a man unearthing a story buried long ago. "This place," he began, gesturing vaguely at the cabin around them, "had too much nothing in it. Too much silence." After they were gone, he paused, swallowing hard. "My wife, my daughter. The fever took them. One winter, much like this one. One week, the house was full of noise. Laughter, crying, singing. The next, just silence. A silence so loud it was like a constant scream in my ears." He finally turned his head and looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of the grief he carried. It was a vast, empty landscape, as bleak as the winter prairie. "I kept busy. I worked until I couldn't stand. But the silence was always here when I came back. It was waiting for me. Then I saw you. In town. You and the boy. You had nothing left. I had too much nothing. I thought." He trailed off, struggling for the words. "I thought maybe you could bring a different kind of quiet. A living quiet. Not a dead one." It was selfish. The confession laid him bare. The stoic, impenetrable man was gone, replaced by a father and a husband hollowed out by loss. His act of rescue had not been one of charity, but one of desperate, human need, to fill an emptiness that threatened to consume him. Tears welled in her eyes, for his loss and for her own. His vulnerability was a key, unlocking the carefully guarded gates of her own past. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small object, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. She unwrapped it and placed it on the table between them. It was a butterfly, carved from a single piece of pale green jade, but one of its wings was broken, the edge sharp and jagged. "My husband was a scholar," she said, her voice thick with emotion. A good man. Too good for the world he lived in. He borrowed money from a powerful man to fund his work. A man who wanted more than just his money back. He wanted me. She looked at the broken butterfly. When my husband refused his offer, there was an accident. A fire. I lost everything. My home. My husband. This was all I could save from the ashes. She finally looked up and met his gaze. The man who holds the debt, who caused the fire. He believes I belong to him now. That my son belongs to him. We have been running for a year. From a man who sees people as property. A man who will never, ever stop looking. The truth of their situations was now laid bare on the table between them. They were not just a man with a haunted past and a woman with a dangerous one. They were fellow survivors, bound by a shared understanding of loss and a common enemy in the form of a cruel, indifferent world. The dynamic between them shifted, solidifying into something new. He was no longer just offering a roof. He now understood he had to provide a fortress. And the true danger wasn't the gossip of a bitter woman in town, but the relentless shadow of the man who was coming for her. The silence that returned to the cabin was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of their shared truth, a quiet alliance forged in the heart of the winter. The fragile peace of the following weeks was a borrowed time, a calm before a storm they both knew was inevitable. The rancher became even more vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He taught the woman how to load and fire the rifle, his hands guiding hers with an impersonal, practical touch. "You need to know," was all he said. She, in turn, worked with a feverish intensity, as if by making herself indispensable, she could somehow ward off the coming darkness. Spring arrived, not as a gentle awakening, but as a muddy, messy thaw that turned the world to mire. And with the passable roads came the threat she had been running from. He arrived on a fine Tuesday afternoon, when the sun was shining with a deceptive warmth. He did not ride a common horse, but came in a polished black buggy pulled by a handsome, high-stepping gelding. He was as out of place in their rugged world as a diamond on a dung heap. He was a man of the city, dressed in a tailored suit and a bowler hat, his face smooth and smug. He radiated an aura of expensive, predatory confidence. He was the transactional villain from her past, the man who viewed people as assets to be collected. The rancher saw the buggy from the ridge where he was mending a fence line and made it back to the cabin just as the man was stepping down. The woman had seen him too, from the cabin window. Her face went as white as bleached bone. She grabbed her son and pulled him behind her, her body forming a desperate, trembling shield. The man smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "There you are, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Did you really think you could hide from me out here in this rustic squalor?" He ignored the rancher completely, his eyes fixed on her. "You have no business here," the rancher said, his voice a low growl. He stood on the porch, his body blocking the doorway. The man finally deigned to look at him, his gaze dismissive and insulting. "I am here to collect my property. This woman, and the boy, belong to me." He reached into his coat and produced a sheaf of papers, holding them out with a flourish. A marriage contract, signed by her late husband as collateral against his debt. Perfectly legal. It states that in the event of his death with the debt unpaid, his wife becomes my ward. All his property transfers to me, including her. He presented the document as if it were a death sentence, an ironclad claim that could not be refuted. "I have the law on my side. I will return in 3 days with the county marshal. You can hand her over peacefully, or you can face charges for harboring a fugitive and theft of property. The choice," he said, echoing the rancher's own words from that first day in town, "is yours." He climbed back into his buggy, tipped his hat with mocking politeness, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. That night, the cabin became a war room. The ultimatum hung over them, a ticking clock counting down to their destruction. Despair was a tangible thing, a cold fog that filled the small space. The woman wept, her resilience finally cracking under the weight of her pursuer's absolute certainty. But the rancher was not a man to surrender. His grief had hollowed him out, but it had also forged something hard and unyielding in its place. "Let me see the papers," he said. He spread the contract out on the table under the lantern light. For hours, they pored over the dense, legalistic script. It seemed impenetrable, a perfect trap. But the woman, whose husband had been a scholar, had learned much from him. She had a keen eye for detail and a mind that could follow the convoluted logic of the law. "Here," she said late into the night, her finger tracing a line of text. "This clause refers to the laws of the territory where the loan was issued. It mentions specific statutes. It was a sliver of a chance, a thread to pull on." The rancher, in turn, revealed a piece of his own hidden past. "Before all this," he said, gesturing to the ranch, "I worked for the railroad, surveying lines. Sometimes we were the only law in a new territory. I learned things. I still know people." He made his decision. At dawn, he rode into town, not to the marshal's office, but to the telegraph station. He sent a long, coded message to a name in a city hundreds of miles away, a contact from that mysterious past life. It was a long shot, a desperate prayer sent out over the wires. He requested information on the statutes the woman had found, and more importantly, a background check on the man who held the contract. Then he returned to the ranch to wait. The next 2 days were an agony of suspense. They went about their chores, but the work was mechanical, their minds elsewhere. The final day arrived, gray and overcast. At noon, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. It was the antagonist, his smug smile firmly in place, and beside him, the county marshal, a grim-faced man with a star pinned to his vest. And riding a short distance behind them, coming to witness her triumph, was the banker's wife. They reined in before the cabin. The marshal cleared his throat, his expression uncomfortable. "I have a legal writ here," he said, holding up a paper. "I'm here to enforce this contract." The antagonist dismounted, his victory assured. "The time is up. Send her out." The rancher stepped out onto the porch. The woman and her son stood in the doorway behind him. "The contract is a fraud," the rancher said, his voice steady. The antagonist laughed. "A desperate claim from a desperate man. Marshal, do your duty." Just as the marshal took a step forward, another sound reached them, the frantic drumming of hoofbeats. A lone rider was galloping toward them from the direction of town, waving a piece of paper. It was the boy from the telegraph office. He slid his horse to a stop, panting, and handed the telegram to the rancher. The rancher read the message, his expression unchanging. Then he handed it to the marshal. "Looks like you had it handled," he said, his voice dry. The marshal's eyes scanned the telegram. His eyebrows shot up. He read it again, then slowly looked up, his gaze fixing on the smug antagonist. "Well, I'll be," the marshal said softly. "It seems this contract is indeed invalid. The statutes it's based on were overturned a year ago." He folded the paper carefully. "But that's the least of your problems. This telegram is from the U.S. Marshal's Service. It seems a man matching your description is wanted for fraud, embezzlement, and suspicion of arson in 3 territories. There's a substantial bounty on your head." The antagonist's face collapsed. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by the slack-jawed panic of a cornered rat. He made a desperate move, lunging for the horse, but the marshal was faster. In 2 strides, he had the man's arm twisted behind his back, a pair of handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. The reversal was total, devastating. The social antagonist, the banker's wife, watched from her horse, her face a mask of disbelief and utter humiliation. She had come for a spectacle of vindicated triumph and had instead witnessed the complete ruin of her ally and her own public disgrace. Without a word, she turned her horse and fled. The marshal, now with a prisoner in tow, tipped his hat to the rancher. It was a small gesture, but it was a profound show of respect. The law, which had been a weapon for the powerful, had in the end served justice. The spring that followed was not just a change of seasons, it was a resurrection. The melting snows seemed to wash away the last vestiges of the long, hard winter of their lives. The ranch, once a place of stark solitude, began to transform. The woman planted a small garden near the cabin, and the first green shoots pushing through the dark soil felt like a miracle. The sounds of her son's laughter, no longer suppressed by fear, became a regular music that filled the valley. The ranch was no longer just a place of function. It was slowly, surely, becoming a home. The rancher changed, too. The deep, ingrained grief did not disappear, but it no longer defined him. The loud silence in his cabin had been replaced by the soft sounds of life. The murmur of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the boys' endless questions. He started work on an addition to the cabin, a new room built of fresh-cut pine that smelled of resin and new beginnings. The steady rhythm of his hammer was the sound of a man building a future, not just enduring a present. He smiled more, small, quiet smiles that reached his winter sky eyes and warmed them. He was no longer a man defined solely by what he had lost. He was becoming a man defined by what he had chosen to protect. The woman and her son thrived. Freed from the shadow of the past, they blossomed in the safety of their sanctuary. She was no longer a desperate fugitive, but a capable, respected partner in the enterprise of the ranch. Her intelligence and resilience were now assets, not just survival tools. Her reputation in the town, once poisoned by gossip, was slowly restored. The story of the confrontation, of the telegram and the marshal, had become a local legend, and the banker's wife held her tongue. The woman and the rancher were now regarded with a mixture of awe and respect. They were left alone. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, the three of them sat on the porch of the newly expanded cabin. The boy was leaning against the rancher's knee, tracing patterns on the dusty floorboards. The woman sat in a rocking chair the rancher had made, a gentle creak marking the peaceful rhythm of the moment. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. They were not a family born of blood, but one forged in the crucible of a harsh winter, bound by shared loss and mutual protection. They were a found family, whole and complete. The rancher looked out at the land, his land, which stretched before them under the deepening twilight. He had once seen it as a place of exile, a refuge from a world that had taken everything from him. Now, he saw it differently. He felt a hand on his arm and looked over. The woman was smiling at him, a genuine, peaceful smile that lit up her entire face. In that moment, he understood a profound truth. A home is not the land you own, he said, his voice quiet but sure, speaking the thought aloud. It is the people you choose to protect on it. And in the quiet that followed, a comfortable, living quiet, he knew he was finally home.